It was Thursday afternoon and men's day at the Windy River Country Club, where I had a standing date to play golf with 3 of my friends. We play golf every Thursday afternoon from the first part of April until the end of October, with rare exceptions. Today was one of those exceptions. John, one of our friends, had called me at 11 a.m. and said, "Sorry buddy, but Rod and I will not be able to make it for golf this afternoon. We have an emergency meeting to go over some blueprint changes on the hospital addition project we're working on." They work together at an architectural firm, and I knew he wouldn't back out on golf unless he absolutely had to. "I apologize for the late notice," he said, "but we just do not have any alternative but to attend the meeting." I told him I totally understood and not to worry about it. "Dave and I will have to find a couple of other pushovers to give us some of their money," I joked. He laughed and said, "I know you're happy to let us off today because you'll save lots of money." We both said goodbye with, "See you next week." I called Dave, one of my best friends, and mentioned the circumstances to him. He said, "As long as John and Rod can't make it, why don't we take the afternoon off from golf too? I can catch up on some projects at home, which will free up my Saturday for something else. I love to play golf, but I wouldn't miss it if we skipped one day either." I agreed, but only after giving him some good-natured ribbing about the change in plans. We agreed to get in touch Friday night to see if he and his wife Carol, and me and my wife Janet, could connect over the weekend for cocktails or dinner, or both. I headed home after lunch, hoping that Janet and I could do something together for the afternoon. When I drove into the garage, her car wasn't there, and I cursed to myself for not calling her as soon as I knew about the change of plans. Oh well, I thought, as long as she isn't home, I might as well make the best of it and do some of the honey-do projects that I had on my list too. I went into the house and looked around for a note from her, but there was none. I also checked the answering machine, and there were no messages on it, so I had no clue where she was. Then I remembered we had caller ID that saved the last 25 calls we received, so I looked at the history to see if there was any clue as to where she was. To my surprise, the last 3 calls were from a number I recognized. They were from Marty's phone. I knew Marty because, for a couple of years, he was part of our foursome. He quit playing golf about a year ago because he had a problem with his back, but he had not left the country club. He was still a social member, and I saw him there on occasion after he quit golfing. John got Rod, a man he worked with, to play with us in his place. Marty was one of John's friends, but I knew him too. I looked back at Wednesday's calls, and there were 2 calls from Marty's phone. I also checked the entire 25 saved numbers, and 19 of them were calls from Marty's phone. I knew that Janet did not get along that well with Marty's wife, so I couldn't imagine why she would have been talking to her. I was bewildered. Just what was going on here? I decided to call Janet on her cell phone. When she answered, I asked, "Hi honey, what's happening?" She said, "Nothing much, I was just vacuuming the living room." "What's up with you?" Now, I was standing in the kitchen, and I didn't hear the vacuum cleaner running. I was pretty sure she wasn't in there since her car wasn't home, but I did walk in there just to be sure. No, she wasn't in there. I told her, "Not much here either. The guys all had other things to do today, so we're not golfing. I thought maybe I would come home and catch up on some of the honey-do projects. I'll see you in a little while." She said, "Oh, okay, but I might not be there when you get home. I have to run to the store to pick up a few things." She sure was thinking fast on her feet, if she was on her feet. I'm not without my own wits either, so I suggested that I could stop at the store for her as long as it was on my way home. She hesitated for a moment but then said, "Okay, that will be great. What is it you need?" I asked, "Just a minute. I have to go get my list." Damn, I married one smart and obviously devious woman, I thought. Pick up some milk, eggs, paper towels, and some steaks for Saturday night. Oh, and maybe some yummy dessert in case we have company, she added. "Okay, bye honey," I said. "I'll see you in a little while." She said goodbye. I figured I better get out of there for a while to see what happened. She obviously wasn't home now, but would she be back in a few minutes? I just needed to get away and think this through. I got in my car and drove to the store but didn't go right in. I sat there thinking for a while. First, Janet and I had been married for almost 4 years. We didn't have any children, but were thinking about having a couple sometime in the near future. I was 32, and she was 28. We had met about 6 years ago after I had gotten out of the Marines. We were both in college at the University of Illinois, she as a freshman and I finishing up my last 2 years. We met and dated off and on for almost a year, then pretty steadily for a year after I graduated. We got married, and she has continued to go to school part-time to finish up her bachelor's degree and get her master's degree. She's almost finished but has been taking the summer off this year. She is a very pretty woman with a nice figure and a wonderful personality to go with her looks. Janet is very well liked among our friends and family, and she almost always turns heads when we go out. I can get a little jealous if men pay too much attention to her, but I have never acted on that jealousy in a way that would upset her, and she has never given me a reason to doubt her faithfulness. Janet was my love, my very best friend, my confidant, my life. Ever since we had been dating steadily, I thought our minds and hearts were melded together. I could sense her feelings, and she mine. I could smell her fears, and she mine. I could feel her heartbeat quicken when I looked at her, and she could feel the desire in me when she walked past me. There were lots of unspoken messages that flowed between us on a daily basis. We just knew each other so well and were bound together so tightly that we were truly one. What could have happened here? I never knew Janet to lie to me ever, and I couldn't see any reason for it now except that she was up to something I wouldn't like very much. I knew she didn't like Marty's wife all that much, but there were lots of calls from his number. If it wasn't Marty's wife, then was it Marty? Then it hit me. At the last country club social event about 2 months ago, he had been dancing a lot with Janet. At the time, I was a bit jealous because she seemed to be enjoying his attention way too much, but I let it slide because he and I were friends and had been close because of the golf matches. As I thought about that, I recalled that we had had a bit of an argument that morning, and she was still upset with me when I got home from work. I don't even remember what the argument was about, but she was rather mad. It also dawned on me that the connection between her and me that I had just mentioned hasn't been as strong the last couple of months. Had I been lulled into thinking everything was still the same? Obviously, I had, but now I knew that something was going on, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. I went into the store, bought the groceries we needed, and headed home. When I got there, Janet was just getting out of the shower and told me, "I just finished cleaning the house and thought I would get cleaned up myself. Thanks for getting the stuff from the store. Why don't you put it away, and I will be down in a little bit." I had never been one to sidestep problems. I guess my Marine training has taught me to face life head-on and without hesitation. So when she came downstairs, I asked her to sit down because I had something I wanted to discuss with her. I said, "Janet, you are my wife, my love, my lover, and my very best friend in the whole world. I have been here for you, and you for me, since we started to date steadily. You were the one person I turned to when I needed a rock to stand on, and I hope you feel the same way." I looked into her eyes and could see a tear start to form. I continued, "I have to tell you, for the last couple of months, I feel like there is a wall being built in a relationship, and that wall has shut me out from your inner self. I don't like it at all. Have I done something that created that wall?" I saw her shaking her head, but no words came from her lips. I continued, "Please talk to me, Janet, and let me know what is happening to us. I can't bear to have us grow apart like this." She had a tear running down her cheek now, and she looked down at her feet and said, "Paul, I don't know why you feel there is a wall being built between us. I love you, and I know you love me. Then why can't you look at me when you talk to me?" I asked. She glanced up at me with a shocked look on her face, then looked back down and replied, "I guess there are some things I have to work through. I am sorry you feel there is a wall between us." With that, she got up and ran upstairs crying. Well, I knew that we had some major problems going on in our marriage. I pretty much suspected what they were, but she wouldn't talk to me, and I had no proof of anything. So I decided to see what would happen. I walked up to the bedroom and talked to her through the bedroom door. "Janet, if you want to talk to me, I am here for you. I love you and want to help you with whatever is bothering you or work on anything I have done that is making you unhappy. Please talk to me when you're ready." I went outside and began to work on the projects. My heart was aching. I don't know how to describe it to you, but I felt pretty empty inside. I don't care if I was a big, tough Marine, the tears flowed, and I felt vulnerable. I didn't know what I would do if I lost Janet. If she wasn't my wife and lover, I just felt so powerless and weak. I was in a panic, to be honest. Janet did not come down for dinner, and when I checked on her at 8 p.m., she was sound asleep. So, I went into the spare bedroom to sleep for the night. In the morning, I got up and went to work early, so we didn't talk then. I called Dave and told him that I thought we probably wouldn't be doing anything together that night or on Saturday either. I asked him if he could meet me for lunch. When we met for lunch, I explained to Dave what had happened and asked him what he thought of the whole situation. He dropped a bombshell on me. He told me that he and Carol had suspected something was going on between Janet and Marty right after the country club social gathering. Carol had seen Janet's car in Marty's neighborhood. I asked why he hadn't said anything to me. He said they talked about it but felt they should stay out of it because they really didn't know what was happening. Okay, I can understand that, I said. Please don't tell anyone that you and I have talked, not even Carol. I want to figure out what I am going to do about this, and I don't need a lot of gossip and outside input. I decided that I would need proof of her infidelity before I could handle the situation. I tried to confront it head-on, but her refusal to talk to me or acknowledge a growing problem between us told me I would need proof before I confronted her with specifics. I took the afternoon off and drove over to Marty's house to see if Janet's car was there. It wasn't, so I didn't know when they might meet again. I called home around 4:30 p.m. and told Janet I would be home at 5 p.m. She said she was happy I was getting home early. When I arrived, Janet was warm and caring. She hugged me and smiled at me with that smile that always warms my heart. I could tell she was trying to be close to me, but it just didn't feel the same. I could sense she was trying, and we never had to try, it just happened. I asked her if she wanted to go out for dinner, and she said yes. When she went upstairs to change her clothes, I checked the caller ID and, sure enough, there were 2 calls from Marty, one at noon and another at 2:30 p.m. I didn't know what to make of those calls, but I knew she hadn't met him that afternoon. The weekend was pretty uneventful. We did a few things together, and she wanted me to make love with her on a couple of occasions, but I just couldn't. So I made up an excuse that I had a sore back. On Sunday night, when I told her that, I saw her shudder and a tear form again. I just couldn't bring myself to be intimate with her until I got to the bottom of this supposed affair. On Monday, I arranged to get a few hours off each afternoon that week so I could check up on Janet. I knew if something was really going on, I would need to catch her. Nothing happened on Monday, but again, there were 3 calls from Marty. Nothing happened on Tuesday, 2 calls. Nothing on Wednesday, no calls. But on Thursday at noon, Janet called me and told me that, since I would be golfing and eating at the club, she was planning on going to the library to work on her thesis for the afternoon and evening, and not to expect her home until around 8:30 p.m. or so. I think she was expecting me to tell her if I was not golfing. Well, I wasn't going to golf, but I wasn't telling her that. I drove over to Marty's house and parked out of the line of traffic so I could watch his house. I had my camera with the telephoto lens so I could take pictures if she showed up. At 2 p.m., Janet drove up and parked on the street outside his house. She got out and went up to the door, and Marty opened it for her right away so she could hurry in. I sat there with my camera, snapping pictures from the time she drove up until she walked in the door and it was shut. I could barely see through the viewfinder because of the tears streaming from my eyes, but I did manage to take lots of pictures. 2 hours later, the door opened and out she came. Marty reached out and pulled her back to himself and kissed her. He was standing in his doorway in a t-shirt and a pair of boxers. She was clearly kissing him back and reached down to slip her hand inside his boxers and rub him. Eventually, she broke off the kiss, and I could see her pointing to her watch. I assumed she was planning on meeting him later as well. She hurried to her car and drove off. The entire time, I was snapping pictures of the kiss, her hand in his boxers, and her driving off with Marty standing in the doorway. I didn't need to see them actually having sex to know that they had been together. You don't spend 2 hours together, kiss like I saw them kiss, and rub someone's genitals like that unless you've been intimate. I knew it. No one can imagine the hurt, disappointment, and anger I felt. My vision blurred, my head pounded, and my stomach was in knots. I could feel my heart pounding like an air hammer breaking concrete. The feelings I had were overwhelming, and I knew at that moment I was lost. My life was over. The one person in the whole world I loved, trusted, and depended upon had betrayed me, broken my trust, and yes, had destroyed my sense of manhood. I would never be able to forgive her. I would never be able to live with her again. I would never be able to live without her. I reached under my car seat for my Glock 37, a 10-round .45 caliber semi-automatic. I drove my car up in front of Marty's house, walked up to his front door, broke through it, and searched his house until I found him upstairs in his shower. I opened the shower door and leveled the gun at him. The shock on his face was unbelievable. I almost laughed at him. I said, "Marty, you and those like you are the scum of the earth. Any man who would go after and sleep with another man's wife doesn't deserve to live. You have destroyed a good marriage. You have destroyed a good woman, 2 good women, actually, including your own wife. You have destroyed me, and now I am going to destroy you." I fired 2 rounds into his groin, 2 into his belly, 2 into his chest, and 2 into his head. Then I left him there and walked out. I drove home and went into the house. I could hear that Janet was in the shower, so I downloaded the pictures onto our computer. When she came downstairs, I was sitting in the family room waiting for her. She was surprised to see me, and I could sense the fear in her. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I told her that I had taken the afternoon off from golf again and that I had seen her arrive and leave Marty's house. I told her that I knew she was having an affair and I had pictures to prove it. I started a slideshow of the pictures to run behind me as I talked to her. I asked her to explain why she did it. I asked her to explain why she didn't talk to me a week ago when I asked what was wrong. I asked her to tell me what I had done to drive her into Marty's arms. I asked her how she could do this to me, to our marriage, and to herself. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, moaning and shaking her head back and forth. I screamed, "Talk to me," but no words came from her mouth. No explanation, nothing. She had nothing to say. The despair I felt at that moment was the worst yet. I wanted to know so much, but she wouldn't tell me anything. She never said, "I love you." She never said, "I'm sorry." She never said a thing, just moaning and shaking her head. Let's check the story from Janet's perspective. The last 6 months have been a blur for me. For most of that time, I didn't know who I was, where I was, or what I was doing. Only now do I understand what happened to me so long ago. Only after months in a hospital and months of psychiatric counseling do I understand what I have done. I wish I didn't understand, but I do. Paul raised a gun and pointed it at me. I was so shocked by the realization that he knew about me and Marty, but when he raised the gun, I got so frightened I just shook. I screamed, "Don't, please don't." Then I looked at the hate in his eyes and knew our marriage was over, and maybe my life too. I could also see the hurt and utter emptiness in his eyes, and it made my skin crawl. I could see him going totally mad, and I knew it was all over for me. This wasn't the man I loved. The man who loved me, this was something else. And yes, I do say something, not someone. He said with a voice cold as steel, "Janet, just look at the pictures." I glanced at the screen and saw shot after shot of me going into Marty's house, Marty and me kissing at his door, me with my hand on Marty's genitals. There were so many pictures proving my infidelity to Paul. Then the last pictures I saw were of Marty lying in a shower, blood everywhere. I heard myself groan with the realization of what he had done. As I jerked my gaze back to Paul, he had turned the gun, putting it in his mouth, and after he said, "Goodbye, Janet," he pulled the trigger. They tell me that police found me in shock, holding Paul. They tell me that gunshots had been heard at Marty's house, and someone got the license number of the car that drove away. They tell me that they knew it was our car and were already on the way over to our house. They tell me that I wouldn't let go of Paul for them to take him away. They tell me that I had snapped mentally, and nothing that was said or done would bring me out of it. They tell me that they took me to the hospital and admitted me. They tell me so many things because I cannot remember much at all from then until now. I do remember what happened before that day. Now, 6 months later, I remember that Paul and I had fought, though I don't recall what it was about, and I was pissed at him. We went to the party at the club, and I was determined to make Paul's life miserable. It so happened that Marty asked me to dance with him, and I thought, why not? I'll use this to make Paul pay. Oh, Marty was slick, I'll give him that. He had me going almost instantly with his compliments. He told me how lovely I was. What woman doesn't like to hear that? He said I was the prettiest woman at the club that night, and I was thrilled to hear it. He told me he always wanted to spend time with me because I was so sweet, so smart, and so sexy. How could I resist such charm? I could have, but I was angry with Paul and didn't want to. I kept encouraging Marty, and I could see that Paul was upset, but he didn't do anything about it. Some twisted part of my mind told me a lie at that moment. It told me that Paul really didn't care, so why should I? Oh, what a lie that was. But I bought into those thoughts so completely that when Marty called me the next Thursday, I believed it and agreed to have lunch with him. We had a pretty intense conversation during lunch about us. Marty told me he would like to make love to such a beautiful woman, and even though I blushed, even though I knew it would be wrong, and even though I felt it would betray the only man I loved, I was too weak to resist his charm. After all, I had convinced myself that Paul didn't care about me, that anything I did to him he deserved. The next thing I knew, we were in Marty's house, kissing passionately. He was a very good kisser, and I could feel myself getting hotter and wetter. I did nothing to resist when his hands slid down my body. I liked the way it felt to have him caress me and kiss me. I needed that so badly. By this time, there was no stopping it. Soon, we were both naked, and yes, we did everything I should have only done with my husband. We made love to each other with our mouths for a couple of hours before he actually entered me. Oh, it was so hot, I will never forget that first time with Marty. I had never been so turned on in my entire life, and when he pushed himself into me, it felt like a hot poker being inserted into me. It had me burning in an instant. I could hear myself begging him to screw me senseless, and that is exactly what he did. He drilled me and drilled me like no one, not even Paul, had ever done. I didn't even try to count the number of times I came that afternoon, many while he pleasured me orally and many more being used by his tool. Oh yes, he used me for his pleasure, but in doing so, he pleasured me like I had never been pleasured before. I have to tell you, I loved it. Make no mistake, I loved it and knew that I would be back for more. That night and in the days that followed, I felt a change in my relationship with Paul. He said there was a wall being built, and he was absolutely right. I felt our connection slipping, just like he must have felt it. I felt the gap forming between us, and my heart was torn from the separation. And you know how stupid I was? I blamed it on him. That lie told me it was his fault. The next week, Marty called me a couple of times every day. He was so sweet and loving, telling me how much he enjoyed making love to me, asking if I was all right. He was perfect. When he suggested we get together again on Thursday, I agreed without a qualm. It was Paul's own fault for not caring about me. We met every Thursday afternoon from then until the night that Paul confronted me. I loved every minute of my time with Marty. The sex was great, and I thought he would wear me out with orgasms because I had so many each time we were together. I made a point of only having sex with Paul when he absolutely insisted, and each time, I would tell myself Marty did it better. I could feel that wall growing between Paul and me and didn't care. Then he confronted me. He told me how much he loved me, how much I meant to him, and what a huge part of his life was tied to me. He told me I was his very best friend, his love, and his lover. He told me I was his rock. He begged me to tell him if he had done something wrong, something to build that wall. He pleaded with me to let him back into my heart. In that instant, I knew. I knew my lie to myself caused me to hurt the only man I loved. I knew I had built the wall, not him. I knew I had betrayed every good thing he felt about me. I was not his love. I was not his lover. I wasn't his best friend, and I was not a rock. I was a cheater, a liar who stopped at nothing to hide her guilt and shame. At that moment, I knew exactly what I was, and I couldn't bear to be with him. I ran up to the bedroom and cried until I fell asleep crying. The next morning, Paul was already gone when I woke up. When he came home that night, I did everything I could to prove to him that I loved him and cared for him. I could tell that the connection between us wasn't there, not like it had been before, but I tried so hard to be the same. I failed. I could sense it in Paul. I didn't think he knew about Marty. I thought he just knew there was a wall between us, but I never dreamed he would have found out about Marty. I should have known better, but I didn't. On Monday, Marty started calling just like he had all those weeks before. He called me a couple of times or more each day, but I told him I would not be meeting with him anymore. He was surprised and didn't understand. Finally, I agreed to meet with him one last time to explain it all to him and break it off. I went to his house again, and yes, we did have sex. It wasn't the same as all those other times. I did have a couple of orgasms due to the intensity of the sexual activity, but it wasn't the same because I knew it wasn't Paul's fault. I knew I was cheating on a man who loved me more than anyone else could. I knew I was a betraying wife and just didn't get off on it like I had before. I told Marty I was sorry but couldn't continue our affair and asked him not to call me anymore. He smiled and said he understood and that he wouldn't be a problem for me. He told me he loved me and would always care for me. He was as sweet as ever, and truthfully, I loved a part of him too. I didn't want him to be hurt either. As I was leaving, he grabbed me, pulled me to himself, and told me how wonderful a lover I was. Instinctively, after 2 months of intimacy, my hand drifted down and into his boxers, and I rubbed his tool one last time. I broke off the kiss and ran to my car to go home and wait for Paul. When I got home, I went to shower and cleaned myself up. I was going to fix myself up for when Paul got home. I wanted to start this night by tearing down the wall that had been built between us. I would rebuild the connection between us, and we would be the same as we had been before. But when I went downstairs after my shower to get some clothes out of the dryer, Paul was sitting at the computer, waiting for me. He told me he knew about Marty. He asked me so many questions about why I had done such a horrible thing to him, to our marriage, to myself. But I couldn't speak. I had done everything I could up to that point to start back to where we used to be. He found out, and now nothing I did could make it right. He found out, and that's all I could think. I couldn't say a word. I just stood there with tears streaming down my face, moaning and shaking my head back and forth. He screamed at me, told me to talk, but no words came out of my mouth. I was in shock. But it was about to get worse. He told me to look at the pictures. When I did, I saw them all, right up to the point of Marty lying dead in his shower. When I glanced back at Paul, I saw the gun. Soon, it was over. He was dead. The next thing I remember is a couple of weeks ago in the hospital. There is some healing going on in my mind. Everyone believes I have made great strides in getting myself back on track. They have talked about letting me go off on my own for some outings. They tell me that after a few more weeks, I could probably go to an assisted living home and eventually have my own home. I am healed enough to understand that my reaction needs to be positive in order for me to be on my own, and I will do everything I can to heal this broken woman. But you must know that once I am free, I will end the torture I have to endure, the torture of knowing that I killed Paul. I killed our love. I killed our friendship. I killed everything I had in life worth living for. I know I cannot endure that torture forever. I will have to end it. For the second story, I looked at my reflection in the mirror, straightened my tie, and pulled it a little more snugly around my neck. I smiled, making sure my teeth were clean and no lingering piece of something or other was there to mar my visage. "Jeff, my man, you look marvelous," I said. I nodded once to myself, impressed with my own cleverness. I stepped back, picked up my wallet and a clean handkerchief, and then, as ready as I would ever be, walked downstairs to the kitchen. I smelled coffee as I strode in and reached for a cup as I passed the counter where they were kept on a small rack. Coffee smells good. I really need a cup before I have to do this thing. This thing was a meeting I really didn't want to have with a vendor I disliked immensely, but he was a necessary evil and I had little choice. It was first thing in the morning, so at least the rest of the day would be tolerable. I didn't hate my job, but it was really boring. I needed a change, and if something didn't happen soon, I was going to make my own change. I was speaking to Essie, my wife of 19 years and the love of my life. Actually, her name was Contessa, but everyone called her Essie. That came from a little sister who couldn't pronounce her name, and Essie was what came out. It stuck. We had a son, Philip, who left for college a month ago, leaving the house an empty nest. At least that's what they called it when the last or only child left the home. Why? I had no idea. Essie and I would still be here, and we counted for something, or at least I felt we did. But hey, who understands those witticisms that everyone says when they don't know what else to say? I directed my attention to my quiet wife. Have any plans of your own today? I asked. I should be home on time, and I thought maybe we could go out to dinner tonight. Save you from having to fix anything? We haven't done that for a while. It might be fun, I threw out, expecting her to turn it down as usual. No, I don't have any real plans, but I might go do some shopping, check out some shops, anything like that. And no to the dinner, I'll be too tired anyway. I'll just call for some takeout. I looked at her, not the least bit surprised by her answer. She wasn't even looking at me and probably hadn't even when I came in or spoke. First, she hadn't been looking at me for some time now, longer than I could remember. Well, I didn't expect you would go for it, but I wanted to ask. Takeout is fine, it's something you've gotten very good at preparing. That was a sarcastic and mean response, but it was also true. I knew I could say it because it would be too much trouble for her to respond with anything other than an apathetic word or two. As I waited, I was proved correct when she simply looked up for a second and then back down, ignoring me. Her response was typical of what I expected, a pattern I had learned to live with. One that began long before today, before Philip left for college, and had nothing to do with the empty nest syndrome that Art, my friend and resident amateur shrink, kept telling me was the cause. Essie had changed a lot in just a short time. We had been happily married for 19 years and dated a year before that. We had been a team, a couple with dreams and plans, sharing everything. But that began to change about a year ago, and the change had become more pronounced as time passed. The Essie I married was becoming a stranger in our home, and the loss was tearing me apart. The real problem was that she didn't see it and refused to do anything about it. In truth, a lot of things had changed. She used to go to the gym with Phil when he was home, but he told me she had stopped several months before he left. She still looked trim and buff, but it was beginning to be obvious that she was starting to slip around the waist, with just a bit of a tummy beginning. Not enough to make her less attractive, but enough to let me know something had changed. In addition, she had begun to be irritable and snappish with me. Nothing major, but it was rare that we could have a conversation without her ending it with some snide comment about me or my habits. Little things like my hours being too long or the trips being too many. I hardly ever worked overtime now and hadn't traveled for almost 7 months, but it didn't have to be correct, just something to snap at me about. The old Essie would never do that without trying to smooth things over by discussion. Essie always talked first and acted later. Her behavior changed radically, affecting how we interacted with others. Essie was just 42 but looked younger. I was older at almost 49, but I tried to stay fit for her. Most people would think we were both younger than our ages, and we had always been proud of that. But that was when we went anywhere together, and that hadn't been the case in almost a year. No reason, just her refusal for one reason or another. In truth, I had stopped asking about 5 or 6 months ago. There was no longer any point. The comment about tonight and dinner was asked in a sarcastic tone, not that she would notice. Just like her answer had been automatic. The thing I noticed, of course, being a man, was that our love life had simply faded away and died. We had always had an active and varied sex life. We did everything and enjoyed each other completely. We knew what the other liked and always made sure that they were satisfied. But that changed. I asked, I begged, I pleaded. I did all I could to find out what happened and why she suddenly stopped wanting to make love. But her answer was just a shrug and a comment about the change of life and being too tired most of the time. She refused to see anyone and finally got angry when I continued to bring it up. Being the man I am, I simply let it go, hoping it would pass once she got through the change. Maybe being the man I am was one of the reasons our life is in the state it's in. All of these things went through my mind as I sat alone with my wife at the table. I finished my coffee, rinsed my cup, and placed it on the drain board. I walked over to the door, picked up my briefcase, looked back at her sitting motionless at the table, and said, "I'll see you tonight." There was no response. I opened the door and walked out to my car, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. God, how I had loved that woman my whole adult life. How I had wanted to grow old with her and do all the things we talked about when we were younger, all the things we dreamed about, the places we could go. It wasn't even a year ago when she talked about the possibility of our moving to Florida if I got that promotion to regional VP. It was a strong possibility and still is. She hated living here in the Midwest, where the winters are long and cold and the summers are short and not all that warm. She hated the cold. I was still depressed as I opened the door to my office and turned on the lights. I settled behind my desk, opened my computer, and waited for it to boot up. I got a cup of office coffee, grabbed a donut from the box someone had brought, and went back to open my email. I was munching on a coffee-soaked bit of donut when I saw an email from my boss requesting I get my butt into his office ASAP. I smiled at that since it wasn't uncommon to be summoned that way. TJ and I went way back, both of us joining Edmunds Manufacturing around the same time. Now, he was a senior VP of design and implementation, and I was a senior manager of research and design. I finished the donut, wiped my face, and walked down the hall to his corner office. I passed the desk of Art Malone, my friend and confidant, and waved in greeting. A quick word or two, a promise to stop on my way back, and then on to TJ's lair. I stopped to talk to Morin, his secretary, who told me to go right in. He was waiting. That meeting was one that changed my life, both for better and for worse. TJ informed me that I had been promoted to VP of Design for the Southeast region. I was going to Miami as soon as I could turn everything over to my second-in-command and finish the projects I had open. I should be able to make the move in less than a month. I had finally climbed to the position I had coveted for so long. Essie and I could move to Miami, and we could afford to buy a very nice home there, subsidized by the company, maybe one on or near the shore, with a slip for a boat and a nice-sized sailboat, motorized, of course. After sharing the news with Art, making plans with my second-in-command, and summarizing the open projects with provisions for either closing them or transferring them, I found it was way past lunchtime. I sent everyone out to lunch and called home. I wanted to tell Essie the news. I dialed and waited but got only the answering machine. I didn't leave a message and tried her cell next, that also went directly to voicemail. So, I just let it go. She was probably with Jane, as she said. I decided to go home early and try to convince her to go out to dinner to celebrate. This had to be worth a dinner, at least. I stopped at the florist and picked up 24 long-stemmed pink roses, her favorite. I also got a large box of chocolates with nuts, also her favorites. I had the card printed with the message, "We finally got to transfer to our dream location. I love you, Jeff." I drove the entire way home humming to myself, a silly grin on my face. I was happy and on top of the world. Finally, things were coming true for us, a new future and a new life awaited in Miami. Essie would change, become my active wife again, and we could begin our new life together, a team like we had always been before she started to change. I stopped that thought. This was a new day and a new beginning, nothing could stop us now. I drove into the driveway much faster than usual and almost slammed into the garage door before stopping. I had to calm down. I was almost delirious with happiness. It was all coming up roses. That reminded me to grab the roses from the back seat, along with the candy and the card, before I went inside. I opened the door, put down my keys, and carried the flowers and candy into the living room, ready to place them on the couch for a surprise later when Essie got home. I rounded the corner and moved toward the couch, only to stop in front of it. As I stood paralyzed, I saw Essie with her blouse open and her skirt pulled up over her waist, sitting on the couch. Between her legs was Bill Parker, our next-door neighbor and one-time friend. In that sudden burst of clarity that comes during some events, I noticed the room, her position, her panties lying on the floor in front of the couch, and his pants down around his ankles. It was all crystal clear and etched into my memory for all time. Neither of them heard me, so they continued what they were doing. Essie was moaning and urging Bill Parker to keep doing what he was doing. She had both hands on his head, holding him in place. It was obvious this was not something new to either of them, as Parker clearly knew what turned Essie on. I used to know that quite well. It seemed I had been replaced. I stood there for another 20 seconds or so before the rage returned. I felt the shock and disgust of what I was witnessing replaced by a cold anger. I wanted nothing more than to kill both of them, but that was not my way. That passed, and then I knew what I wanted to do. Still holding the flowers and candy with the card, I walked into the room, moving around the couch and stopping in front of Essie, standing behind the naked Bill Parker. I kicked him hard in the butt with my foot until he stopped what he was doing and looked over his shoulder. All he said was, "Oh." Essie's eyes opened wide as she met mine. The lust began to fade, and her eyes grew wider and wider until I was afraid they were going to pop out of her head. Then she began shaking her head back and forth, saying, "No, no, no," over and over again. She realized her position and began pushing Bill's head away at the same time he was trying to pull back. As a result, he ended up sitting on his back in front of me, almost sitting on my shoes. Essie stared at me, her eyes now full of tears and her lips trembling with shame. She was trying to pull her skirt down and close her blouse, neither of which was easy to do with her hands occupied with both tasks. I watched, my disgust clear on my face, as she looked back up at me, her mouth working to form words. My disgust faded, but only to be replaced by pain at seeing what my world had become. I felt the betrayal, the loss, the anger, and finally the pain. I knew it was over, I had lost her forever, and there was no way back. I decided to finish this now. I took the 24 long-stemmed roses, pulled them out of the small vase they came in, and threw them at her where she sat. I watched as they hit her in the face, falling around her body onto the couch and the floor. The vase followed, hitting the wall behind her. Finally, I took the box of candy, opened it, and dumped the chocolates on the floor as well. The card followed, landing on the edge of the couch. "Now I understand why you were always too tired to go to dinner with me or to make love with me. I see it now." I turned to Bill Parker, who was trying to get his pants up and his shoes on. I waited until he straightened up and then hit him in the face with all the anger I felt inside. I was pleased to see blood spurt from his mouth as he fell down again. I watched as he levered himself up on his arms and directed my next comments at him. "I don't know how you intend to explain this to your wife after I fill her in on your afternoon activities with my soon-to-be ex-wife, but be prepared to explain it. Now get the hell out of my house before I throw you out." I said no more but went upstairs to pull down a suitcase and begin packing. I was still furious, but the anger was now fading, and a new feeling, one of deep and racking pain, began to fill me. The loss of all I had believed in was almost too much to bear. The long rise from the euphoria of the promotion and then the equally long fall to the worst depression of my life left my legs suddenly shaky. I was almost finished packing when the pain became so strong that I had to stop. I sank to my knees on the bedroom floor and cried as I hadn't since the day my mother died. I let it come, knowing there was little I could do to stop it. I waited until it had run its course, leaving me empty. I felt her as she put her arms around me, holding me tight with her cheek pressed to the top of my head. She was comforting me as if I were a baby. "I'm so sorry, Jeff. I'm so sorry." That was enough to stop my crying. As the anger returned undaunted, I swallowed once, letting the anger grow until it burned bright again. It pushed the pain down and back, forcing it to release its hold on me. "Take your filthy hands off me and get away from me. You stink of sex, and you make me sick." I stood, my legs still shaking but beginning to get stronger, and closed the suitcase. I turned to look around and saw Essie kneeling there, her face contorted in shock and covered with tears. Her shoulders were shaking with her sobs, but I no longer cared. I went into the bathroom, grabbed my shaving kit. It had my razor, toothbrush, and several other odds and ends I kept for traveling. I put those things into a small plastic bag and walked back out to grab my suitcase. I pushed past Essie, still standing in the doorway, and threw the bag and the suitcase down the steps, caring little where they landed. I went back in, looked around, picked up one or two small things from my bedside table, and then walked down the steps to find my bags. As I walked out the door, I heard Essie screaming at me to stop, to come back and talk to her. But I wanted only to be gone from that place. I knew then that my marriage was over, and I felt a small breath of relief that it had finally come to this. Everything had been moving this way for the past year, and now it was time to accept that it was finished. All the sniping at me, the avoidance, the disregard for me and my needs, and the total disrespect that I had endured were over. Miami was waiting, and I was going alone. As I drove away, I decided I wouldn't say anything to Bill's wife, Joyce. She had her own demons to fight, and a useless husband wasn't going to change anything for her. Bill had his own hell at home to live in, and I wished him and Essie the best. They deserved each other. I had a new job, a new place to live, and freedom to enjoy the rest of my life with someone who would love me for who I was. I never looked back. I had been feeling depressed and anxious for some time now. I knew part of it was that Philip was going to college soon and I would be alone for most of the day. Another part was the beginning of that time in a woman's life before menopause, when she begins to feel she is no longer young and beautiful and alive to all that life has to offer. My world had been Jeff and Philip in the house and the things I could do to make their world a pleasant and safe place for so long. Now that the fear of losing all that was almost a sickness, I was feeling very strange most of the time. It was nothing I could pinpoint or something I could tell a doctor about, just a strange feeling that something was wrong. I felt off, not myself, and I was beginning to become worried about it. I hesitated to talk to Jeff about it, knowing he would try to get me to seek help somewhere. He was a man who could only think of trying to fix things. I didn't want things fixed, I just wanted to be left alone to take care of myself. Nothing needed fixing. He had already talked to me about my unwillingness to go out or do things, and the decline of our love life, something I had little or no interest in now. For the life of me, I didn't know why. I used to love making love with my husband, and nothing had changed that. I just couldn't get up the energy to do it now. But that would change again, things would run their course, and I would be back to the way I was. I just needed time. He wouldn't believe me, but I knew I was neglecting him terribly. He tried to do things for me, asked me to go to dinner, to a play, or just out anywhere, but I said no. Nothing he suggested raised any interest inside me. I soon got tired of his asking and began to snap back at him, saying mean things that I later regretted but never apologized for. I finally began to let it go, just letting his pleas slide off my back. I started to ignore my husband and often my son. Later, it got even worse, but by then it was too late for me to change it. I didn't realize it at first, but my decline had begun. I began to let my time at the gym with Philip slide, since I doubted I would continue once he left. I didn't enjoy it that much anyway, but Philip loved the way it made him feel and wanted that feeling for me. While I enjoyed his enthusiasm, I never got into it the way he did. I began to miss some sessions, then more and more, but it was dumb luck that things happened as they did. Just after I decided I was going to quit, while I stopped wanting to exercise with my son, I did enjoy the attention of the other men at the gym, not in any way other than to make me feel better about myself. They meant nothing to me in any other way, certainly not in a sexual way. I wasn't even sexually interested in my husband, so it was very unlikely I would get aroused by someone else, especially not a stranger. I wasn't interested at all until Bill Parker began to show up at the gym more and more. Bill was our next-door neighbor and lived with his wife, Joyce. Joyce was a recluse, almost an agoraphobic. At first, she went out only when absolutely necessary, sometimes to a party, but she much preferred to entertain at her house when others invited her and Bill. She refused and made no excuses. Bill tried to get her to seek treatment, but she refused to leave the house and made only token attempts to talk to anyone except by phone. That was useless, and she discontinued it at the first opportunity. Since then, she remained housebound. Like most of his friends, I had stopped visiting Joyce, bothered by her problems and uncomfortable around her. I wasn't much of a friend. Bill was 10 or 12 years older than me and owned a small hardware store in town. When Joyce began to stay home and her illness was diagnosed, Bill decided to sell his store and stay close to home with his wife. He had been with her for over 30 years, and he felt it was his duty to try to help her. He did all he could for her, but she continued to get worse. Finally, she refused to leave the house except for doctor's appointments or emergencies. Those also became rare, and eventually, she left not at all. We began to talk during our breaks at the gym, and I learned more about him and Joyce. I apologized for not visiting Joyce more, but he simply said he understood. He told me their entire story, and I found myself feeling sympathy for him. My heart melted at the sadness I saw in him. I wanted to help him, but all I could do was let him talk. I listened and became more and more sorry for him. I wished there were more I could do to help, but I was helpless to change anything for him. I found Bill to be a charming man and, once, I noticed he had a very well-built body with a flat stomach. I also noticed a nice bulge in the tight gym shorts he wore. I especially noticed that it got bigger after he had spent some time talking to me. That started some thoughts in my head that had been missing for some time. The only real problem was that when Bill was out of my sight, so were those thoughts. My husband didn't cause them to reoccur in the evenings, and they lay dormant until I saw Bill again at the gym. Those thoughts got me thinking. The next time Bill and I were together, watching Philip work out, I gathered my courage and asked him about his love life with Joyce. He seemed embarrassed at first but finally told me that there was no love life anymore. Joyce had no interest and refused him whenever he made an attempt. She got angry if he tried and called him names if he persisted. He had finally given up and no longer considered her a wife, except in name only. But he was too much of a man to divorce a sick and needy woman, especially when he had left that night at home. I made my decision. I knew what I could do to help Bill and, at the same time, help myself. In my own mind, it was so clear. If only Bill could arouse those feelings in me, and if Bill was forced into chastity by a frigid wife, then I could help both of us at the same time. It was so simple. I would offer to have sex with Bill for his satisfaction as well as mine. Since I couldn't become aroused by my husband and he couldn't satisfy his cravings with his wife, it seemed like a perfect solution to our problems. It was so clear to me at that point in my life, so very simple. At no time did I consider that what I was going to do was cheating on my husband. I couldn't get aroused by my husband, so I was not meeting his needs, and he couldn't meet mine. In my own mind, I thought that this way I could regain my own desires, and maybe they would carry over into my marriage bed. That would be a good thing for Jeff, wouldn't it? Bill could get some satisfaction with my body, and that would be good for him. Hopefully, I would get some satisfaction from Bill. Gauging from the way his pants bulged out when he was talking to me, it seemed to be a clear win-win situation. With that thought, it was settled. The following day, I went to the gym with Philip, and Bill was already there. I watched him work out, admiring his body as it glistened with sweat. I wanted to reach out and rub those shining, wet muscles and feel that bulge in his trunk so badly that I felt things I hadn't felt in months, perhaps even years. I was horny. I was actually getting turned on by watching Bill's body. God, I knew that I had made the right decision. Once he was through with his workout, I talked to Bill and told him what I had decided. He listened, his mouth curving up into a wide smile, and he actually blushed. He was almost comically grateful and said he had wanted to make a move on me for months but was afraid it would ruin our friendship. He had some reservations about doing this behind Jeff's back, but I explained our lack of lovemaking, and he seemed to accept that. Actually, Bill would have accepted anything I told him just to get into my pants. I understood that. I knew men, and Bill was all man. We made plans for the first time to meet at my house. Bill would tell Joyce he had to go somewhere, drive around the block, park his car, and walk through the back gate into the house. No one could see him once he entered the yard, and no one would be interested in him anyway. Jeff would be at work as usual, and Philip would be gone all day on a trip to one of the local colleges with his senior class, so I would be alone. I waited in the kitchen, watching the backyard until I saw him come in, close the gate, and almost run to the back door. I held the door open, and he came in without slowing down. It wasn't until he stopped and turned that he noticed I had on only a robe. I stood there grinning at him, and when his breathing had slowed, I untied the belt, letting the robe fall open. Underneath, I was naked. He let out a groan, almost a sob, as his eyes roved over my naked body. I admit to being turned on by his admiration, and I pushed the robe from my shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. I stood there naked and fully exposed to this man who was my neighbor and Jeff's friend. I let him devour me with his eyes, feeling no shame and no regret. He waited only seconds before walking over to me, pulling my body against his, and pressing his mouth over mine. He was not gentle, and that turned me on even more. I accepted his tongue into my mouth, my own meeting and dueling with his. It did not take long before I heard myself screaming at him to do me harder and harder. He answered with a growl of pure primal lust. I was almost unconscious from the sheer pleasure. We came down together, both of us spent and sated. I let my legs relax and fall to the floor as Bill lowered my body back down. I moved to the bathroom. Bill watched me go, his own pants lying on the floor beside him. I closed the door and let everything inside begin to seep out of me. I cleaned what I could with toilet paper until I felt clean enough to put my clothes back on. I would shower later, but for now, I was okay. I walked back out to find Bill dressed again and sitting at the table, looking cautiously at me. I smiled, walked over to kiss his cheek, and sat down opposite him. "Thank you, Bill. That was more than I could have hoped for. You were wonderful, and I enjoyed it very much. I hope this is just the first of many times we can help each other." "No, please, thank you, Essie. I never expected that to happen. I have never climaxed so hard in my life. You are a wonderful lover, and I agree that this should be only the first of many. Do you think we could do this again tomorrow at the same time?" "I think we can. Philip will be in school, and we can make it upstairs to the bedroom next time." This time was too quick, but it was wonderful. "I think we can be more comfortable in bed. We can take more time to get to know each other and find ways to make each other happy." That was the beginning of our affair, which continued almost daily until the end of the school year. After that, we were more careful, and the frequency began to decrease until we got together once or twice a week, and sometimes even less. Bill was still a wonderful lover, and I enjoyed our time together. The only problem was that nothing I did carried over into my husband's bed. I still had no desire to make love with him, and I felt nothing I was doing was wrong. I knew that I was not thinking correctly, but I didn't care. I didn't want to give up Bill, and I didn't want to make love with my husband Jeff. As a matter of fact, I got angry at Jeff because he couldn't turn me on like Bill. The one thing I knew was that I didn't love Bill, and the thought of living with him was not one I would ever entertain. I loved Jeff. That was a surprise I wasn't even aware of until it was too late. But I did know that in my heart, and although it didn't stop me from doing what I was doing with Bill, it kept me feeling safe knowing I had the love of my husband Jeff to fall back on. Funny that I never doubted that thought. Losing my husband wasn't even a glimmer on my radar. The summer ended, Philip went off to college, and Jeff continued to work predictable hours, leaving me and Bill more time for our sexual liaisons. Things were slowly ending with Bill, and we both knew it, but we still got together as often as we could. Sometimes, we just did oral for each other, as the effort of full sex wasn't worth our time. I loved the way Bill did it and often let him go at me as long as he liked. I would blow him if he asked, but I didn't really enjoy it very much. He seemed content to do me, and I let him. That's what he was doing when Jeff walked in and caught us. In retrospect, I remember it like it was just an hour ago. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, my blouse open where Bill had been fondling my body. He had pushed me back, dropped to his knees, and lifted my skirt up to my waist. I leaned back, enjoying what he was doing, and let my body respond. The climax was still a ways away. I was just beginning to feel the stirrings of lust when I felt Bill jerk and pull away. I opened my eyes, and as the lust died, I stared into the eyes of my husband Jeff, standing there. Now, as I look back on it, certain things remain clear and precise. The first time I looked into his eyes, I saw disgust and anger. Then, as I watched, the anger began to be replaced with something else. It took a minute, but then I recognized it. I had seen it a few times before in my life with Jeff. It was pain coupled with sadness. I can't begin to tell you what that felt like, to see that pain and sadness and to know that I was the cause of it. Nothing in my life hurt as much as that knowledge, not even the loss of my parents when they died in a fiery car crash. That look, the one I saw that day, will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. As bad as that memory was, it was far less than the one that happened a few minutes later. Bill dressed and ran from the house with only a quick, "I'm so damn sorry." I watched him go, blood dripping down his chin, understanding that for the first time in almost a year, I felt nothing for him. I cared nothing about what might happen to him as I slowly walked up the steps to find Jeff. At that point, I don't believe I fully understood what had happened and how my life was going to change. I only knew that I had to go to my husband and try to explain. I walked into the bedroom and stopped in total shock. My husband, the man I loved with all my heart, the man who provided a strong, loving home for me and our son, was kneeling on the floor, his head in his hands, sobbing his heart out. I almost died myself. At that instant, all I wanted was for God to take me then, and let me not have to see what I had caused for my husband. My heart broke at what I had done to this man. I went to him, knelt on the floor behind him, and held him in my arms. I held him tight, whispering softly to him that it would be all right, that it would be all right. I had to tell him. I had to let him know, "I'm so sorry, Jeff. I'm so sorry," over and over, holding him and waiting for him to hear me and understand. I wanted only to comfort him, to love him as a wife should. He pushed me away, back and away, as if he couldn't stand my touch. He was angry, and in his anger, he said words that still echo inside my head when my eyes close and everything becomes quiet. He said words that caused my world to stop and change forever. His words were, "Take your filthy hands off me and get away from me. You stink of sex and you make me sick." They say when you die, your whole life flashes in front of you. That could well be true because I think a lot inside me died that day. But my whole life didn't flash in front of my eyes, just the things I lost, my life with Jeff, my home, the times we spent as a family, the dreams we shared for our future, our plans for our retirement years, all the things I loved and cherished. Those are the things that died that day, and part of me died with them. Today, I'm sitting here in a small apartment that I rent month to month. I could afford better since Jeff left me comfortably provided for, but I have no desire for anything more. In front of me are the final divorce papers, marking the end of my marriage. Jeff has moved on with his life, now in Miami, the place we both once dreamed about. It feels like that was forever ago, but it was actually only a year or so. I saw the note after he left that day, the words almost screaming at me about what I had lost. It lay on the floor near the scene of my debauchery, our dream location. "I love you, Jeff." My apathy and disinterest have returned, briefly banished by my betrayal of my husband and my losing fight to regain my marriage to Jeff. I fought the good fight, but I was hampered by his refusal to talk to me or try to understand what I had done. It took me some time to realize that the why was never important, what mattered were the facts, especially to Jeff. And what could I really say to him? After all, I did it, and I continued to do it even after my rationalization of trying to restart our love life faded away. It was okay to lie to myself, but I couldn't lie to him, not after what I did. Our son, Philip, hated what I did but eventually forgave me. He's my only connection to what I used to have, a life with a man who loved me and whom I loved back with fierce passion. Why that passion deserted me for a time is still a mystery I fail to understand. Over and over, I search for a reason, any reason, but none comes. But it's too late now anyway, so why dwell on it? My life now, as much as it was before Jeff ended it, is stagnant. I go nowhere, do nothing, and think of little else but what I lost. I never see Bill anymore and don't want to. I sit and think and remember what once was. Mostly, I recall my thoughts as I decided to have my affair with Bill. It seemed so clear, so simple then. I considered the good things that could happen, the pleasure I wanted and could enjoy, but I never once thought about the consequences of my actions. I never considered what could go wrong or what bad things might happen. I focused only on what I could gain from it, never on what I might lose.